everybody, welcome back to chemistry. If I can increase the slide, it says a sample of 9.05 grams of solid calcium hydroxide, and you're given a molar mass, is added to 32.5 milliliters of a 0.420 molar aqueous hydrochloric acid solution. And it says, write the balanced chemical equation for the reaction. And then there's some other things that we have to figure out. We have to figure out what is the limiting reactant, how many grams of salt are formed after the reaction is complete, and then finally, how many grams of the excess reactant remain after the reaction is complete. So if I can reduce the slide. Okay, so let's first try to write out a balanced chemical equation for this reaction. So you are told what the reactants are. And so you are told you have calcium hydroxide and hydrochloric acid. So first, let me go ahead and write formulas for these reactants. And so calcium hydroxide is an ionic compound. And so maybe one of the things you might remember is that calcium will have a 2+ charge, and the hydroxide is OH minus. And so calcium hydroxide is CaOH2. And then hydrochloric acid is a strong acid. And so I'm hoping at this point you just sort of flat out know what the formula is. And so it's HCl. Okay. So now what we have to do is figure out what the products are. And so there are a number of ways you can do this. So let me just show you one way here. So one thing I'm hoping you can sort of see here is that calcium hydroxide is a base. And the reason is it has the hydroxide ion, and then hydrochloric acid is an acid. And so this is going to be a neutralization reaction. And so you might recall anytime you react a base with an acid, you will get a salt and water. So you have to figure out what the formula for the salt is. And so let's see if we can figure that out. So the way a neutralization reaction works is similar to a ionic reaction. So you might remember here you have to imagine the calcium breaking off and replacing hydrogen and sticking to the chlorine here. And so one product you're going to get is calcium chloride. And then the other product you're going to get is water. So now we have to figure out a formula for calcium chloride. And so calcium is Ca2+, chloride is Cl-, and so I'm hoping you can figure out this is CaCl2, and then we have water. And then what you have to do is you got to make sure you balance the equation. So right now it looks like we have one calcium on the left, one calcium on the right. 2 chlorines on the right, we'll put a 2 here to balance chlorines. Let's check what else do we need. We have 2 hydrogens here for a total of 4 hydrogens on the left side. We only have 2, so I think we need to put a 2 here. And once we do that, that's balanced. So let me just kind of clean this up a little bit, and then we'll solve the problem. Okay, so what I've done is I've rewritten this equation, and so the next step is we have to figure out what the limiting reagent is. In other words, we have to figure out between these 2 reactants which one is limiting. Is it calcium hydroxide that is the limiting reactant, or is it hydrochloric acid that's the limiting reactant? And so the way you do that is you're going to have to figure out the number of moles for each reactant, and then from each of those moles figure out how much moles of product are produced. And the reactant that produces the least moles of product is the limiting reactant. So let's go ahead and take the information we have in the problem, see if we can get this into moles. And so we have 9.05 grams of calcium hydroxide. We are not given a mass of hydrochloric acid. Instead, we're given a volume and a concentration. So we have 32.5 milliliters of hydrochloric acid, and we have 0.420 molar hydrochloric acid. And so let's go ahead and figure out the moles of each. So we're going to try to find the moles of calcium hydroxide. and the moles of hydrochloric acid. So let me do the calcium hydroxide first. That's pretty easy. So you start out with, so this is calcium hydroxide, right? And so you start out with 9.05 grams of calcium hydroxide, and so you just place in the molar mass correctly. So it's going to be 1 mole of calcium hydroxide, and the molar mass of the calcium hydroxide is 74.093 grams of calcium hydroxide. And so the grams of calcium hydroxide cancel out. And so when I do this calculation, I get 0.122214 moles of calcium hydroxide. All right. So now we have to figure out the moles HCl. That's a little bit trickier because we're not given a mass of HCl. Instead, we're given a volume and a concentration. So let me show you how I would deal with this. What we need to figure out is the moles of HCl. So I will take this 32.5, well, first let me write HCl here. I'll take the 32.5 milliliters of HCl. Let's get that into liters. So I write here 1 milliliter, 1 times 10 to the negative 3 liters. And then how do you take something in liters and get this into moles? Well, they gave you a concentration, which is 0.420 molar. So let me talk about what that means over here. So we have 0.420 molar means the same thing as 0.420 mole per liter. So now I think you can see is that you can use this fraction, just place it here. Let me add in HCl like this, just to clean things up a little bit. And you can see the liters of HCl cancels out. And so when I did the math earlier, I got 0.01365 moles of HCl. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the information here and just clean up the board a little bit. Okay, so we're still trying to figure out what the limiting reactant is, whether it's calcium hydroxide or HCl. And so we figured out the moles of calcium hydroxide we have and the moles of HCl. And you have to figure out between these two which one produces the least amount of product. The one that does is the limiting reactant. And so you can choose either calcium chloride or water to figure out how much product you have. I'll just choose calcium chloride. So basically what I'm going to do now is figure out if I have 0.122214 moles of calcium hydroxide, how much product calcium chloride will I get? So I'll do that here. So calcium hydroxide, I have 0.122214 mole calcium hydroxide. So now I use the mole ratio in the equation that for every 1 mole of calcium hydroxide, we get 1 mole of calcium chloride. So it's times 1 mole calcium chloride over 1 mole of calcium hydroxide. And you get 0.122214 mole calcium chloride. Okay, so now we're going to take the moles of HCl and figure out how many moles of calcium chloride we get. So now this is for HCl, and we have 0.01365 mole HCl. And then you note that for every 2 moles of HCl, that reactor we get 1 mole of calcium chloride. So it's 1 mole calcium chloride over 2 mole HCl. And so when you do the math, I got 0.0000 0.6825 mole of calcium chloride. Okay. So what you can see is calcium hydroxide at its concentration gives you this much amount of calcium chloride. HCl at this concentration gives you less calcium chloride. So now we know that the HCl is the limiting reagent. So I'm going to put an L here for limiting and an E here for excess. And so I'm going to clean up the board again, and then we'll go on to the next step. Okay, so we go on to the next step, which is we're trying to answer how many grams of salt are formed after the reaction is complete. Okay, so here are the two products, and one of them, calcium chloride, is a salt. So they're trying to figure out here how many grams of salt are formed in this chemical reaction. And so what I'm hoping you sort of know at this point is you can figure that out from one of the reactants, but the reactant you choose is going to be the information for the limiting reactant, because it's the limiting reactant that sort of determines how much product you're going to get. So let's go ahead and get the moles of this limiting reactant, which is HCl, and then we'll figure out the moles of calcium chloride produced, and then we can figure out the grams of calcium chloride produced. So here we go. So we have 0.01365 moles of HCl. And we see that for every 2 moles of HCl, you get 1 mole of calcium chloride produced. So it's 1 mole calcium chloride over 2 mole of HCl. Okay, so now we're at the moles calcium chloride, so now we just multiply by the molar mass of calcium chloride. So it's going to be 110.98 grams of calcium chloride over 1 mole of calcium chloride. And so when I multiply those numbers and round this correct number of significant figures, I get 0.757 grams of calcium chloride. So that is the amount of salt that's going to be produced in this reaction. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the final question, but before I do, let me clean this up a little bit. Okay, the final question reads as follows. How many grams of the excess reactant remain after the reaction is complete? Okay, so you figured out earlier that the hydrochloric acid is the limiting reactant. But now what you have to do is figure out, well, if this calcium hydroxide, you started out with 9.05 grams, how much is left unreacted? So that's a little bit tricky. So let me suggest a way that you do that. Again, you always start out with the limiting reactant. And we know the moles of limiting reactant that are there, they're going to be used up. And so you ask yourself this question. If I have 0.01365 moles of hydrochloric acid, how much of the calcium hydroxide will react with it if for every 1 mole of calcium hydroxide, you get 2 moles of HCl to react with it? That's kind of the first step. So let's go ahead and take care of that. So we start out with, again, 0.01365 moles of HCl. And again, we're going to try to figure out, well, if the ratio of calcium hydroxide to a hydrochloric acid is 1 to 2, how many moles of HCl will react? So it's going to be 1 mole of calcium hydroxide over 2 mole HCl. And so now you can see that the moles HCl cancels out and you get moles calcium hydroxide. Okay. So now what you have to do is take moles of calcium hydroxide and get this into grams. And so the molar mass, I think I gave you there, makes it a little bit easier to solve the problem. And so the molar mass is, let's see, 74.093 grams calcium hydroxide over 1 mole calcium hydroxide. And so if you do this, what I got earlier was 0.50 0.5685 grams of calcium hydroxide. So here's the thing. You might think that this is the answer. It is not, because here we just worked out if you have 0.01365 moles of HCl, how much of this 9.05 grams will react with it. And we figured out that only a small fraction of the 9.05 grams will react with it. It's 0.505685 grams. So they want to know is if you start out with 9.05 grams of calcium hydroxide, and this is the stuff that is used up in the reaction, how much is left? So if you do the subtraction here, I got 8.54 grams of calcium hydroxide. And that is what is left unreacted in this problem. Okay, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.